afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
And I hope that you are all well. I think the
Good
first thing I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be sharing my screen so that you are able to see the presentation. Okay. Yeah, so once again, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great privilege and an honor to once again to be part of ACTI and to be part of these webinars and to be able to share with you this morning on a topic that I believe is once again a very, very important topic, something in which I've had experience and a topic in which I have considered this quite a bit. And in my engagement with different seminaries, I've had the opportunity of evaluating a number of seminaries regarding their sustainability and initiatives that they have, especially around third stream income. So I'm going to be speaking for a while, and I'm going to be trying to speak very slowly so that everybody is able to understand. But yeah, maybe just as a word of introduction, to give you maybe an overview of what it is we're going to be doing. I did not share this in a separate slide, but to give you a sense of where we are going. So there's going to be a few topics or a few areas that I'm going to be seeking to cover in this presentation today around third stream income. The first thing that we're going to be doing is we are going to be defining what third stream income is all about. What exactly do we mean when we speak about this? I'm going to do that very briefly and then also be sharing what I call an illustration as to why this is important in theological education. Then we are going to be covering a number of topics and areas. So I'm going to be talking about why third stream income matters. Then I'm going to be talking about what I call strategic opportunities in third stream income. Then I'm going to be sharing a few slides of a number of examples of third stream income possibilities and different ways in which different seminaries, especially in the majority world, have sought to, to subsidize what they are doing and what they require financially in theological education. And so I'm going to be explaining, some of the initiatives that they have come up with as far as third stream income is concerned. And then after the examples, I'm going to be doing what I might call an evaluation of what I have seen. What are some of the key considerations around third stream income? Then a basic and a brief implementation plan as far as third stream income is concerned. And then as part of this evaluation, I'm going to be talking about some of the benefits, some of the risks, some of the critical issues around third stream income, especially as I've experienced it and as I've seen it in different contexts within the majority world, particularly in Africa as well as in Asia. Um, and then we're going to conclude and we're going to allow for some question and answers and testimonies, etc. So that's just to give you an overview of what it is that I'm going to be seeking to cover. So to start out then, we are wanting to define what third stream income is and to establish why it is important in theological education. So a brief definition then of third stream income and what it is that we mean by it is third stream income refers to revenue or income that is generated beyond the traditional funding streams that we all in theological education tend to be familiar with. So, in other words, if we take a look at our financial needs as institutions, the money that we need, the money that we budget for, that will help us to try and cover our expenditure for any given year, what then typically happens is that we will typically depend upon what we are all familiar with, and that is called first stream income sources. So, in other words, as educational institutions, we will then typically draw in money, draw in revenue from that which we charge our students. We will normally call that tuition, the tuition fees, but in some instances, there might be additional fees that we will charge students, either for specific services that we offer them. That might cover things like a general administrative fee or for specific services that our students might have access to, sometimes for internet, sometimes for printing, etc. But then some of our institutions also offer accommodation. And so that will generally be covered in what we call the general fees that we charge our students. And so because that is part of our core business in terms of what we do in theological education, our students generally pay for that. And so that will then be the traditional way in which we get our income, our tuition and fees. And I think many of us, especially who have been involved in the administration of theological education and in leading theological education institutions, will know that as a general rule, that which we charge our students in terms of tuition won't cover our operational costs or what we need to be able to do what we are called to do. And so, therefore, we are normally also dependent upon, and there's a long history of this in theological education, where we are dependent upon donations and or grants that is given to us from different sources. So donations that we will receive will then be a second stream of income or additional income that we receive that helps us to effectively subsidize what students are paying as far as their education is concerned. And these donations normally comes from individuals. They could come from, churches. But for many of us, and for many institutions, especially institutions that are connected with denominations, they will often get a specific grant or what you might call a subsidy, or in what in some contexts are called a subvention. And this is normally denominations that will have an official training institution that will, in an annual grant, normally paid out on a monthly basis, but a designated sum of money that they will give to the institution that generally forms part of a donation to them to try and help and cover their costs. Grants can also include sometimes subsidies that we receive from other sources. Some institutions might be connected with universities, state universities or private universities, where through a cooperative agreement with those institutions, you might be able to get a grant. And so that results in particular funding. But though all of that will generally fall in what we call second stream income. So third stream income can therefore also be called a non-traditional source of income, or what we more specifically could call entrepreneurial income. In other words, income that takes us beyond the traditional sources that we normally depend upon to help us cover our expenses. And I think normally the best way to try and explain that is through and by means of an illustration, and this is more an illustration of what our experience is, and this helps to affirm why, in many contexts, engaging in third stream income sources is of importance. So I've personally experienced this, but I've also seen this to be a general rule and a general reality as far as theological education is concerned. That when we take a look at what is the kind of income that we derive from students in terms of what they pay tuition or additional fees, when we compare that to what our operational budget is, in most instances, and I state this as a general average, what we discover is that what students actually pay normally only accounts for about 40% of the income that we need in order to cover all of our expenses. So what the implication of that is that there generally is additional funding that we need that on average is up to 60% of what our budgetary requirements is. And therefore, donations and grants is very important, because that helps us either to be able to meet that 60% that is needed in order for us to be able to balance our budget, for any given year. But what I've seen in most instances is that even institutions who do receive donations and those who do receive grants, even from the denominations that own them, it still results in some gap in terms of their funding as far as their budget is concerned. And what I've seen is that institutions that tend to operate on this first and second streams of income, who don't engage in third stream income, will often shortchange either their staff, their faculty, as far as their salaries and the remuneration is concerned, and they will often practice or engage in what we call deferred maintenance. In other words, they will take the first major expense that we typically tend to find within our financial responsibilities, and that's the payment of our faculty and staff. We won't be able to pay them, what they are actually worth. And so we will kind of shortchange them. And so we know that they do it out of love and not out of trying to become rich or to make money, but they do it sacrificially. But they often do that to the degree that the institution can only afford, so that it can, at the end of the day, balance its budget. And so that's the practice that we often engage in. And if that is not enough, then we normally go to the next largest item on our expenditure, and that is maintenance, and so we tend to practice deferred maintenance. So even institutions that often say that they've been able to balance their budget of those traditional sources of income, I've often found that they are doing that at the expense of their staff, their faculty, in not being able to pay them what they are worth, or a reasonable kind of salary, as well as shortchanging the institution as far as deferred maintenance is concerned. And that is why third stream income therefore becomes important. So to try and summarize that, why then is third stream income important? In other words, finding this non-traditional, other than normal source of income as far as meeting our needs is concerned. And I will boil it down to three issues. The first one is something that we are all aware of, and that's the issue of financial sustainability. How sustainable are we as institutions? In other words, are we making enough funding? Are we generating enough resources, not only to meet our needs, our current needs for any financial year, but what about the potential of expanding and then continuing until the Lord Jesus returns? In other words, what is our health as far as sustainability is concerned? And so third stream income helps us to address that challenge that we are often experiencing, that most seminaries are always living on a financial knife edge, in which we are maybe 1 or 2 months away from going bankrupt, if we might put that in business terms. But yeah, third stream income is therefore a way of helping us to address the issue of financial sustainability. Secondly, third stream income speaks to the issue of institutional resilience. I think it is remarkable that many of our institutions, especially within the majority world, have been able to survive for as long as what it has been able to. Especially more recently, given the experience in 2020 of COVID, when there was this major disruption, not only within the world, but also within the funding of theological institutions. And for those of you who will remember, when I did the webinar on fundraising, I shared some statistics as well as some testimonies and stories of some well-established historical seminaries, even within the developed world, who, because of COVID and because they have not been able to find a way of exercising institutional resilience, they've ended up closing down. And that's still a sad reality that we face today. So I would say the first two bullet points of why it matters, often speaks to the negative experience that we have, the pressure that we often feel as institutions financially, the fact that we're always needing more money. Yes, we are trusting the Lord, and we do need to trust the Lord. Yes, we are praying, and we do need to pray. But at the end of the day, as part of our stewardship responsibilities, as part of the management part of our stewardship responsibilities, we have to be aware of what our financial health is as institutions in order to reach a stage in which we are sustainable and in which we are exercising institutional resilience. But I think that there's a third aspect to this, why I think third stream income or pursuing a third stream option is important. Because I do think it speaks to the issue of mission expansion, that we need to be in the world in which we're living in. We need to think differently. We cannot depend upon history and upon some of the sources and resources that we have grown so used to, in which we know from experience to try and charge students what it actually costs to educate them would be impossible. And that secondly, as far as second stream income is concerned, I think we are all aware that even depending upon donations and grants and subsidies is not something that we can take for granted. It's not something that we can say we will always be subsidized by the church or by churches or by rich individuals. But also by individuals, and there are many of them that often sacrificially give towards the work of the Lord as far as seminaries is concerned. But that if we begin to not just think negatively about third stream income, and we think about it positively within the broader aspect of what is our mission in theological education, I think third stream income will provide us with opportunities, unique opportunities of not only fulfilling the mission to which God has called us, but to allow us to be involved in areas and initiatives that we maybe haven't done before, that could turn out to be a blessing not only to us who are involved in theological education, but also to the communities and the churches whom we are serving and where we are operating. So I do think it is very, very important, for us to take seriously the opportunities that third stream presents us with. So now I want to begin to talk about some of the specifics. And I honestly believe that as we look at ourselves as theological education institutions, whether we call ourselves seminaries or Bible colleges or Christian universities, that when we begin to think of third stream income and we begin to think about who we are in terms of our identity as educational institutions, I think that if we pay serious attention to that aspect of our identity, it actually presents us with four immediate potential areas of thinking third stream. In other words, of thinking beyond the normal or the traditional ways in which we normally derive our income, the financial resources, the revenue streams that we need in order to fulfill our mission. The first one that I raise here is of potential areas is educational services. In other words, we need to think about ourselves and saying, while we tend to specialize in theological education, in which we might focus our attention upon the training of people for ministry, we are training pastors, we are training missionaries, we are training Christian workers, But if we think of ourselves in terms of broader educational value that we can bring, um, since most of us, were founded and formed, and we do see that as still our core business, and that might be represented in terms of our flagship programs that we have, that we are training people for Christian ministry. If we begin to think broader about what Christian ministry means, then using that very foundation, using that very identity that we have as educational institutions, we could be thinking a little bit broadly. For example, we could say, what are the other areas that we could be preparing vocational Christian workers for rather than just in the church? What about training chaplains, as some of you might be doing? What about training Christian teachers? In other words, all of this falls within the general sense of our primary responsibility, our primary calling, and that educationally, so that if we begin to broaden that, it could present us with opportunities to say, well, this could then be another way in which we derive income that could be seen as third stream income that helps to subsidize what our core business is. The second area is in the area of knowledge and publishing. When we look at all of our institutions, the people that we employ as our faculty are often highly educated people. These are people that many of them will have PhDs. Some of them will even have more than one PhD. Most of them, if not all of them, will at least have a master's degree. So we've got people within our institutions that have got knowledge, and that knowledge is often confined to the programs and the classrooms that are there at our seminary. But what if we are willing to think about how we could expand and share that knowledge base? Not just in terms of teaching, but in terms of publication, and to get our faculty and those who are specialists in different areas to start not just publishing for the sake of meeting that need of what we often call nurturing our sense of academic significance, but to say how through that knowledge base can we be of benefit to the broader church or to the broader community that could offer opportunities so that when our faculty do write books and they do publish, what exactly is the financial model for that? Are they just doing that, to be able to put it on their CV that they've published a commentary or they've written a book, or they have now published their research? But how could that be maybe disseminated in such a way that could generate some kind of income, not just for them, but for the very institution that has afforded them the opportunity to do that? So I think that's a second opportunity that falls within who we are as in terms of our identity that we maybe need to think about. But then we also have, and most of our institutions, we've got facilities, we've got classrooms, We have got chapels. We have sometimes got conference rooms. We have got facilities. We've got office spaces. But we've also got assets like land. I've seen seminaries that have got huge plots of land that lies vacant, in which there's nothing happening on that. And then they've got the small institution, the small buildings in comparison to the amount of land, and the land is just lying there and it's doing nothing. It's not benefiting us. And so, how can we think about our facilities and the assets that we have, and instead of just using it to fulfill our own needs and our own sense of call and ministry, but how could those facilities be used in such a way that it could potentially generate income? Not just to cover the cost of those facilities, but that could maybe make a contribution towards our overall costs. So I want us to think about that. And in fact, when I share some of the examples of third stream income, you will see how some seminaries have done exactly that. How they have taken their facilities and how they've thought about their facilities as well as their land and other assets that they have, and how they could appropriate it and use it in such a way that it could actually generate additional income for them in order to be able to meet their ministry needs. And the fourth area, I think, is what I would call community services. So traditionally, a lot of our seminaries tend to become guilty of being what we call ivory tower institutions. We exist, we say, yes, in service to the church, in which we are training ministers of the gospel, we are training missionaries and other people that's going to be of service to the church. But we find ourselves within communities, where those communities are not necessarily Christian. And we are operating there and we are offering services to ourselves. But what about extending what we have to our communities? And you will see once again in some of the examples I'm going to be sharing how some have actually done that by creating services, not only for the seminary community, for their students or for their faculty and staff. Sometimes they've expanded that into their very communities as they to fulfill a broader sense of mission, but how that sometimes has actually also generated additional income. So, without trying to necessarily be too creative or too out of the box, as we sometimes think that third stream means. And it can mean that. And so I'm wanting to say, when we take a look again at the examples, you're going to see some examples that are truly out of the box, that goes way beyond who the institution is as a training ground for ministers of the gospel or for Christian workers in a general sense, but how, in order to fulfill that mission, they've come up with unique ways in order to subsidize that. But yeah, what I'm saying here is these are strategic opportunities that are tied to who we are in terms of our identity as educational institutions that often are missed opportunities for us to be able to say it's not actually that far-fetched or too difficult to engage, at least in an initial stage within third stream income. Right, so in the next few slides, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be sharing what I have seen taking place in many different seminaries within the majority world, in particularly on our continent of Africa, as well as what I've seen in other places within the majority world, like Asia, of opportunities that seminaries have engaged in order to generate third stream income. And I'll try and just explain further what some of these examples are all about. And you will see how some of this actually comes out of what I've just said in the previous slide, of where, given what they have as institutions in terms of their identity, who they are as an educational institution, albeit that it is in the area of ministry training or theological education, but how they have not only used that, but the very facilities, the very campus that they have as a way of generating additional income. So some of this is quite obvious, and I'm sure some of you and many of you might be involved in some of this, but some of it might actually be unique. So first of all, what I have seen is that some institutions get involved in the rental of their facilities, which includes their buildings, their classrooms, their chapels, etc., their housing. Some institutions will often have housing for faculty, but as well as dormitories for students, as well as their land. And so how have they done this? Well, sometimes they've done it to say that they maybe have an empty house standing on their property, that a faculty member doesn't need. And so they end up renting that to somebody outside of their normal community, and that income comes towards the seminary or the institution as third stream. Some institutions I've seen are closely located to other institutions. Sometimes they are close to public universities, and typically public universities are often looking for additional accommodation for their students. And so some seminaries have done that to open up their dormitory facilities when there is space available for students coming in from the outside. And they've sometimes done this in a way in which they've tried to attract Christian students, because we know that if you are just opening yourself up generally and you get non-Christian people coming onto your campus, doing the hiring of the facilities or the dormitories, it could create problems, as far as your reputation is concerned. So we are saying, we are making that assumption. It's not just generally a general market related rental, which it could be, but sometimes it can be very focused. Some institutions I've seen have often rented out their facilities to churches. In fact, I've seen seminaries that have invited churches within the community to actually rent their chapels, because think about that. And I mentioned that in the second item when we're talking about church partnerships. Some of our institutions have got beautiful chapel buildings, which we tend to use maybe depending on our chapel program. I know seminaries that will only do chapel once a week, and then we tend to use chapel for maybe an hour. But that chapel might then be standing empty for the rest of the week if we're not using it for our teaching needs. And so I have seen institutions who say, well, over the weekends, we're not using our chapel. We will actually rent it out to churches so that they can use it for their purposes. I've seen seminaries who have, in the beautification of their facilities, like their chapels, have rented out their facilities for conferences, for wedding venues, etc. I've seen a seminary that renovated part of their dormitories into a three-star hotel. Because they were in a context where there was a lot of traffic, there was a lot of people coming through the town and the institution as tourists, and they actually would do that. Especially during holiday times when the students would be away and the dormitories are standing empty, they would actually temporarily create an hotel. So in other words, this is looking at our facilities and asking ourselves the question, what are the opportunities for being able to generate additional income through these creative ways? Some seminaries have engaged in what we would call business partnerships. And what I mean by that is, and let me give you a few examples, so some of us find ourselves in contexts where we might have large tracts of land. And sometimes there are telecommunication companies who, given the expansion, especially across our continent, of cell phone providers and internet provision via microwave towers or even via cell phone towers, they are often looking for places to put up these towers. And they are often willing to pay substantial amounts of money to rent land. But in the process, they might actually give you special rates as far as your own internet or telecommunication needs is concerned. So that's a creative way of being able to use your land if you are strategically located and if you've got land to spare. And often these telecommunications companies, they only need a corner plot, somewhere within the corner of your facilities, which if we plan it well, using a very good site development plan, we are able to potentially generate quite a bit of income that way. Sometimes your campus might be located in very strategically along certain main routes or highways, etc., and then engaging in third-party advertisement on your campus. In our context, that's a possibility, if you fulfill certain bylaws, within the municipality and the country. But, these advertisers, as long as, as an institution, you have some control over that which is being advertised, because obviously we don't want a third party company coming in, and then they advertise products or services, that is completely out of sync in terms of our Christian identity, and who we are as an institution. And so in each of these cases, you have to be very careful who we partner with and what we do. But other things like internet cafes, I've seen spring up on campuses, which has become a way for them to even subsidize their own internet infrastructure. Some institutions have engaged in what we call service partnerships, by expanding their offerings in counseling, creating clinics, not only to meet the needs of their campus community and their students, but to also service the very community in which they are part of at a minimal cost, but often doing it in a way that it actually generates some kind of income for the institution. Others have opened up restaurants, they've opened up grocery stores, they've opened up bakeries on their campus to not only meet the needs of their own community of students, but also opened it up to their community, and competitively offered some of those services. Um, yeah. What about publications? I've mentioned this earlier, so I'm not going to be spending too much time on this. But we've got well-educated, well-resourced people that could be sharing their knowledge in a way that could be of benefit to the institution in terms of their publication, their training materials, Sunday school materials, could be developed out of that. So we could be servicing the church, we could be servicing our community, through the sale of those materials. Obviously, for us, in our context, farming initiatives I've seen are quite big, especially where our seminaries find itself in communities, that tends to be maybe rural or semi-rural, but especially where we've got large tracts of land that is arable, and that on which we can, without much effort, actually get involved in a farming initiative. So I've seen seminaries that have used their land to create fresh produce, to fish farm, to farm poultry, palm oil, etc. All kinds of things that in which that produce is not only there to help their own community of students, but often they produce enough to be able to sell in their community, and so that becomes a very profitable business. Some have engaged in production of bricks. I've seen a number of seminaries who have expanded some of their buildings, some of their classrooms, sometimes some of their accommodation. And one of the ways they have found to help save and cut their costs is to produce their own bricks, especially if they have access to some of the resources or it is cheap enough to do that. That has not only helped them to cut the costs of their own capital expansion in terms of buildings and classrooms and houses, etc., but often they have continued doing that by selling those bricks or slabs to the community, and they've been able to generate an income from that. I've seen a number of seminaries involved in water purification, because it was not only their own needs, but became a need within their community. And so sometimes very robust, but sometimes very small, but real meaningful water purification facilities that they've established in order to not only produce clean, drinkable water for themselves, but also something that could be sold to their community. On a small scale, I've seen tour guide initiatives. Many of you follow Bethlehem Bible College in Bethlehem, in Palestine, Israel, will know that that's one of the things that they do, because there's such a lot of religious tourism that happens there. Not at the moment, because we know there's a war in the Middle East, but the Bethlehem Bible College even offers a course to train tour guides who are able to be religious tour guides for religious tourism that happens. But I've also seen this with seminaries that find themselves in situations where there's a lot of natural beauty, where tourists do come, and they then also get involved in some of those initiatives. Some institutions have opened up shops, charity shops, thrift or second-hand shops. In fact, this was something that in our own seminary, we even used and experimented for a while. But once again, related to who we are as institutions educationally, there are often opportunities that we miss. But I have seen seminaries who have actually broadened the opportunities for education to say they are going to be looking across the ages. From preschool, early childhood development, they will create those facilities on their campus where on a Christian basis they offer that to not only to their student community, but also to the general community in which they find themselves. And they've turned that into a profitable business that provides an additional income to the seminary. Some of them have included junior schools, high schools. In fact, I visited a seminary in India that had a junior school and a high school on their campus, for which they catered for 1,500 students. This seminary had 11 buses in which they bused students to and from the school. And in fact, the education that they offer is something that parents, even though they are not in a rich community, the money that the parents pay to have their children have a good Christian-based education provides a significant income to the seminary. So I've not just seen this in Asia, I've seen it in Africa as well. But, thinking more broadly about who we are as educational institutions, offering chaplaincy programs, offering programs in leadership for NGOs, for Christian-based NGOs, even for government workers. I've seen this happening, where seminaries offer courses in ethical leadership, that they open up, and they reach out to politicians, to people who are working in municipalities. And these people are willing to pay, especially if we've got the educated staff to do that. Joint programs with universities often produces significant income as a third stream income. Then some of the more sophisticated ways in which this can happen is through investments. And obviously we know that there are a lot of institutions, especially within the developed world, that with many, many years of existence, often their third stream income comes from investments, from capital funds or capital initiatives through legacies, etc., where they are able, and they've been able to do this over many, many decades, have been able to build up funds that they are able to invest in the open market, either through money market or through equities or through property funds or other initiatives. I've even heard of some who have dabbled in e-currency, Bitcoin, etc. But ways in which they've been able to save money in some way and invest that money, and through a drawdown process, be able to generate third stream income. The seminary that I was part of for many years, that eventually became, through a lot of effort and a lot of hard work and specific fundraising initiatives, became our mainstay as far as our third stream income is concerned. But then finally, just to as a few other final examples, some through some of their fundraising initiatives have always set aside savings. In other words, seminaries who engage in different fundraising initiatives, they will often say that instead of using all of that money from their fundraising initiatives, they will actually put aside or set aside a portion of that fundraising initiative into some kind of savings that will help them for the next year or for what they might call a rainy day. And so savings from fundraising initiatives is also what I've seen. And obviously there's the issue of events, so I will end off with that one, because there are all kinds of events that I have seen seminaries engage in, that even the seminary I was part of, that we had engaged in to help us as far as third stream income is concerned. Gospel concerts, golf days, market days, in which people pay for the privilege of being there, or they pay for certain services or goods, etc. And that becomes an event that could produce profit that can go towards meeting our budgets. Yeah, and so what I've done now in these slides is to kind of broadly sketch what I've seen many seminaries doing as a way of producing third stream income. Many of these initiatives have been very helpful, very profitable, but maybe there are others, maybe there are some ideas or some testimonies that some of you are wanting to share. And so please feel free to share that in the comments, and that could also become part of our discussion a bit later. But now I want to transition, and I want to start talking about some of the practicalities when it comes to engaging in third stream income, because a lot of the initiatives that I've shared now, that can be all well and good, and they can be very helpful and they can be very meaningful. But I'm wanting to say that engaging in third stream income is something that we need to look at very carefully and very intentionally. Because as much as what third stream income can be a real blessing to an institution, and I've seen that as a real blessing, it can also be a hidden space for a lot of problems. And that if we don't do it properly, we could get ourselves into a lot of trouble. So I want to share that there are some key considerations that we need to take a look at when it comes to being involved in third stream income. And I just want to state this very broadly. When we get in third stream income, we need to have a sound understanding of what the costs might be, and that probably will be involved in getting involved in a third stream initiative. Sometimes we just see the dollar signs, and we say, oh, we see the potential for getting a lot of income. But in order to get money, we sometimes have to spend money. And we always want to make sure that what we are getting is not being undermined by what we are spending. In other words, we only want to engage in a third stream opportunity if there is a sense of profitability. And so that our goal in third stream income must always be for it to be profitable. And so therefore we need to have a sound understanding and a good handle on what the cost implications are of the third stream opportunity that we're engaging in. Because sometimes doing that is going to mean that we're going to have to sometimes hire extra staff, or we might be placing an added burden on our existing staff. But no matter what we do, because it is rare that you've got a third stream income source that is just passive income, there's always going to be some people involved in that initiative. and that's going to be costing you money, and that has to be accounted for as far as your overall profitability of the initiative is concerned. Some of the third stream initiatives is going to involve infrastructure and sometimes some materials. For example, if you identify brick making, as maybe being a contextually relevant or a real opportunity for you, there's going to be some initial costs that you're going to be involved in. There's going to be some raw materials that you're going to be needing. Some of that might be sourced within your context and maybe even on your campus. I've seen that happening, but most times we are going to have to import those materials. We're going to have to buy those materials. Then there might be machinery and equipment, but there's also electrical costs. There are water costs that might be involved in that. And so we need to evaluate, and we need to be able to say that while we see the potential for profitability and an income, we also need to understand that there's going to be overheads, there's going to be costs. But then what are some of the other costs? Marketing, so say, for example, we're involved in a farming initiative, and we are growing bananas, for argument's sake. And we want to sell that. Now we might be going into the process of actually taking those produce to the market. But sometimes we might want to sell it right there and there from our campus, And so what marketing are we doing? And that often costs money. And some initiatives might even involve additional technology or technological costs. So what we are saying here is that we mustn't just see the potential income that we are going to be getting from an initiative. We need to cost it independently from our regular costs. Yes, in some instances, there might be overlap, because we might have a staff member who was serving in an administrative capacity within the institution, but then also serving your third stream income source. We need to have an understanding of what the cost implications is of what we are going to be doing. So yes, we need to understand what we are going to be putting in, what it's going to cost us, before we are able to say, and as part of the process of calculating what the profit is going to be, and we're going to have to ask ourselves the question, is this actually worth our while? Because sometimes you can find, and you're going to see this as part of the risks and the cautions I'm going to be talking about, that we might have a wonderful initiative that's generating a lot of funding, so there's a lot of cash flow. But at the same time, there could be a lot of cash going out as well. And then you have to see what is the bottom line. And that bottom line, even if it is a profit, we have to ask ourselves the question, is it worth the effort of us actually doing this? Because, it might be taking a lot of energy, it might be taking a lot of time, and it might not even be worth the kind of profit it is generating. And so I have to say that this is very important, that we want to make our third stream initiative profitable, but we need to hedge those profits. We need to guard those profits, so that ideally our third stream source of income, while for many of us, I understand and I appreciate this, it might be to meet the gap in our operational costs. Since we are often dealing with, financial margins that are very small, because we know we're not in this to make a profit in terms of what we are doing. We ideally want to, balance our budget. But there's nothing wrong in wanting to make a profit, but we're not doing this at the expense of, meeting our needs and putting the education beyond the means of most people, So we're always trying to maintain a balance. So yes, while for many of us, third stream might mean that it's to help us to meet whatever shortfall we have in our operational costs. Ideally, are wanting to suggest that third stream should be funding other initiatives like scholarships, faculty development, and to meet some of the big issues, that we are often dealing with, for example, maintenance. Some of the other key considerations I believe that is very important is for governance and oversight of the initiative. I believe it is important that the senior leadership structures within our institutions, like our boards, they need to be aware of the initiative, and we need to make sure we secure their approval as far as this is concerned, and they need to be aware of the risks. The board won't necessarily be involved in the third stream income source, but that will probably then fall on the senior management of the institution. Um, there are some cautions I will mention around that, but I'm saying that at the end of the day, it's the senior leadership structure within the institution, the senior management structure, academic one, the management structure that must execute, but that must also delegate. In other words, we don't want to burden necessarily our administrative staff as far as the third stream opportunity is concerned, because that can create its own problems. But, it has to be something that is understood as part of the overall financial structure of the seminary is concerned. And that is why it's always going to be important to make absolutely certain that there is accountability as far as the financial structures is concerned. Not just the operational structures, accountability, to have accountability, and this is very critical, but especially in terms of the financial structures. Because I've sometimes seen, and this has been a few cases that I'm aware of, where seminaries, without realizing it, have had fraud and corruption take place within the space of a third stream income source because they have not had oversight and they've not had enough accountability structures in place. But I've also seen how some seminaries who's been involved in third stream income have not realized that they've been making a recurring loss on their third stream income. So that very thing that was supposed to help them had actually become a burden to them, And so we need to make sure that we don't find ourselves in trouble as far as that is concerned. Right, so we're coming very quickly towards the end of this presentation. So I just quickly want to lay out what I call a potential implementation roadmap. In other words, if you as an institution have not considered third stream as a means of being able to subsidize, your revenue streams, and it's something that you're wanting to start. I try and describe what I see as 4 basic steps that one could follow. I'm going to expand on this very briefly, but it is about, first of all, assessing opportunities. And here I'm wanting to emphasize something I've said before, that when we engage in third stream income, I see this as a very, very important part of our implementation roadmap. That whatever we do or whatever we attempt to do as far as a third stream income source is concerned, it must be culturally and contextually relevant to where we find ourselves. Because sometimes we can see something that works elsewhere or in another context that's very, very successful, but we mustn't necessarily make the assumption it's going to work in our context. And so we have to pay careful attention in terms of what I call assessing the opportunities. Then secondly, we must prioritize. Thirdly, we can start what I want to suggest is a pilot project. And then fourthly, if that pilot project really shows that it's worthwhile and that it could be beneficial, you then scale the project. So let me just quickly expand on these 4 steps and say, in other words, step 1 is always to make sure that we assess the opportunities, that we have an understanding as to what our capacity is as an institution to engage in third stream income, that we are able to identify potential initiatives. Sometimes you can find one initiative that is just that magic initiative, that for the effort that you put in really brings in the profitability that helps you to meet your financial shortfall. But sometimes you will find it will eventually boil down to maybe two or three initiatives. But you don't want to start three initiatives at the same time. You want to identify what is going to be the different initiative. And part of that is we need to make sure that we look at and a needs assessment. So that's the first step. The second step is to prioritize. We, I think, choose an initiative. In the step of choosing an initiative, I believe at our mission and what our mission involvement is, and look at the financial viability of the potential initiative, and then our institutional capacity. So I see that as three important issues that we need to consider as part of a significant step in terms of trying to implement potentially a third stream initiative. Then thirdly, to run a pilot project. That is always very good. Having done the necessary homework and the market analysis or the needs assessment, find something within your immediate field. I would say, before we tend to jump outside of, trying to be too creative and saying, here we have an initiative, that is really out of the box. Sometimes there are things within our capacity, within our immediate fields. Like some institutions have gone to online learning, not just in terms of their programs, but also for broader impact, and sometimes that's a way of being able to broaden your income streams, but within the ambit of what it is you are doing. Maybe it's going to be an annual leadership conference or a pastors conference, something that you've never done before, but something that is within, I believe, many institutions' capacity, and then to ask, is some type of rental of your facilities, of your land, kind of viable? So once again, you'll remember right in the beginning, I said, what is it that we have within our hands? What is that we have within our immediate resources that could help us, to be able to initiate something? And then finally, as a fourth step, once we've run that pilot project and we see it as worthwhile and it is something that we can do, I believe that any viable initiative can then be expanded alongside the demand, but balanced with mission impact. In other words, we need to always make this assessment, in terms of, is our initiative working? And so then finally, in the last few slides, I'm just quickly wanting to then affirm, first of all, that there are benefits, I believe. I've experienced this. I've seen how the important role that third stream can play. The benefits to the institution in engaging in third stream will help us to address the issue of sustainability, the issue of innovation, growth, as well as mission impact. But let me say that there are risks that we need to be aware of, that we need to consider, and this is normally part of that needs assessment. Whatever we do, we need to ask ourselves, is there potentially a risk to our reputation as an institution? By engaging in third stream, is there a risk that people could misperceive who we are, or that we could find ourselves finding a dent to our reputation because we're engaging in a business initiative that is sometimes seen as problematic, or in which there are ethical things around that could be damaging to who we are and our identity? So those are things we must take a look at. There's a risk of mission drift, that we could become so engaged and engrossed in in the third stream that we forget why it is that we are there. So the third stream must help us to be able to fulfill our core business. We need to be aware of potential financial losses. And sometimes, a third stream income source can be profitable for a while, but there are times it could be a loss. And then sometimes we just need to wrap it up and then we need to give it up and we need to look at other opportunities. We need to consider potential legal exposure. In some contexts, engaging in third stream could not only have legal implications, and sometimes this could be, because you are now engaging in competition, with other service providers, that could create problems. But sometimes there are taxation implications, that we also need to consider. Staffing strain could also be a risk in terms of who we engage and how we use them, and the potential of burnout, even as far as this is concerned, as well as some potential governance challenges, especially if we don't engage our boards, etc. So yeah, I just want to mention that. And then to say, as we come towards a conclusion, this is my second last slide. There are a few critical issues that I'm wanting to say. As much as what I believe that third stream is something that we need to consider and that can be of benefit to us, there are some things that I have seen and I'm wanting to say is very, very important for us to consider. One of this is that the institutional head should not be burdened with running the project. We mustn't take our principal or our rector or our president, whoever is called, and that person becomes the champion. They can come up with the idea, but they mustn't be involved in the nuts and the bolts of the third stream because they have more important things to do. I always believe we need to have a business-minded person, a person who can ethically, on business, good, sound, biblically based business principles to run this initiative. And that person might not be a pastor. But if we find a reliable business person or minded person that's not going to come as an added burden to us, that is going to be the kind of person that we need to look at. But that we also need to ensure regular managerial oversight. We need to have updated reports, accurate reports on how that project is running. We need to maybe develop a good and a clear business plan as far as this initiative is concerned, and then also to ensure financial accountability. So I've spoken about that last point previously, and I think the rest over there is almost self-explanatory. So finally, I'm wanting to say, before we open it up to questions, comments, testimonies, concerns, that third stream income is essential, especially if we see it as part of a broad-based fundraising strategy within our institution. It is something that will help us in terms of our long-term survival and something that I believe can contribute to strengthening our mission's impact. So thank you very much for this opportunity that I've had of being able to share some issues, some ideas around third stream. And as I've said, these are things that I myself have been involved in and that I've found very beneficial and that I've seen as I've engaged in other ministries that have particularly taken a look at the whole area of sustainability in theological education. So I'll hand you now back to
Dr. Linzay, thank you so much for today. I have seen many texts to say we so appreciate what you've done. It was so good just to hear you talk this through. Thank you so much. People have also asked about the recording. All